Hello, and welcome to Through the Veil, where we get together to share stories and remember the wisdom that has always belonged to us. I'm Melissa Camrudin, and this week Adelaide Meadow is joining me to chat about the blueprint for sisterhood and community. I've been following Adelaide for a long time, and really just for her strength training practices. She has so much wisdom to share about the female body and how it differs from the male body, how a lot of Western physiology is designed around the male body, and it just really hit home for me. And so I've enjoyed so much of her free content and always really I was just waiting for postpartum and to sign up for one of her strength training programs, or for all the women's work. And I recently discovered she's got a whole other thing going on that we're gonna talk about here. So she had a post a few weeks ago about the myth of the like-minded community, and how when we're searching for people to be just like us, we miss out on some community. And that was really interesting to me. That has proven true in my life, and I really liked that. And then she had another set talking about I think you can hear the little baby with hiccups here, being in community with people we disagree with and how we do that. And I was like, that is so interesting. So everywhere I go, I see people seeking community, and it's something we talk about in groups. Where's the community? Everybody's so alone. What's happening? And, I think this might be the way. This is the way someone has found it, and she's teaching people. So enjoy the episode. Tell me what you think. Send me a message. Where is community at for you right now? Hello, Adelaide. How are you?
Hi, Melissa. I'm doing great. I'm so happy to be here in conversation with you.
Yeah, me too. I'm really looking forward to this one. Tell us a little about yourself, like what work you're in, how did you arrive there?
Totally. So my name's Adelaide Meadow, and I am a biomechanist or a biodynamicist. So I study the female body and all of the magical ways that it works, but mostly from a structural perspective. I also am a home birth midwife, and so I attend women and babies at home who are having their sweet little ones come into the world. And I do a lot of community organizing and education for women. So I came into my work really from a community organizing background, and I'm very interested in what people actually mean when they're saying that I want women's community, I want sisterhood. Like, what are we talking about? What does that mean? And how do we actually, not from a sort of esoteric or ideological perspective, but a boots on the ground, day in, day out, what does that actually look like in person to be interested in women's community? So I run a well woman care practice. So I see women for a whole host of pelvic health concerns, all women's health concerns, in which we do a lot around biodynamics, biomechanics, movement, and pelvic health. And that is the perspective from which I also do my midwifery practice. So essentially, think about pelvic health and midwifery. I run that private practice. And then in addition, I do community organizing for women.
I find all of it so interesting. That's like right up my nerd alley, right? All the things I like to talk about. But what really got me interested was something you posted a few weeks ago about being in community with women who don't necessarily agree with you. And that one really clicked with me because I see like we're alone a lot in our culture, and women crave community. And I go to these birth circles and I can see it just like speaks to women's souls when they come into community. But it's actually a skill that's learned. And I actually learned it growing up in church.
Yeah.
I learned how to be in community with people who are different than me. Right. And it's just how it was. It's just like a little church. And so you don't just get to pick your favorites. You're going to be in community or you're not. And it was just a natural skill. And I don't attend those places anymore like that. And so I've often thought, like, how do people get it then? Like, how do people get the skill set, and where do you find community? And there was just so much resonant truth in what you said about it's not your echo chamber is sort of how I heard it. Like, it's not it doesn't come in all finding women who agree with you. And yeah, you want to speak to that?
Absolutely. And I love this conversation because I want to offer a few sort of semantic definitions, maybe for lack of a better term, of what is community and what are we
Mm,
actually interested in doing and having. For me, and you don't have to agree with this, but this is where I come from. And when I teach on this perspective and think about it and organize around these principles in my own life, community is in person, first and foremost.
mm,
I always just want to say that community is the people that you're actually physically surrounded by. And my online, I run an online business. I have a telehealth practice. I, put out a lot of content. That's obviously how you came into relationship with me. Though we discovered that we actually have
yeah.
significant in-person community connections, which we love. But um, that is a new social space. And like the women who are interested in my Instagram, they are like followers for lack of a better term, which like that one sounds kind of cringy,
Mm,
but that's actually the relationship we have. We're not actually in community. We might be in conversation, but even
mm,
still, that's cool. I can be in conversation with someone, or maybe we're then moving to get to know one another better if we're in like a live online cohort, something like that. And then we are sort of bridging that gap a little bit. But ultimately, my community is not like the conversations I have on Instagram. My community is not the people who, maybe take my courses. My community is the women that I serve directly, and most of them in person, and maybe on occasion women that I get to know quite well over the course of lengthy timeline through live online communication that then hopefully transitions into some IRL time. So
mm,
that's one. The other thing, I gave a talk on this, maybe you can link it. It's like a free 2-hour talk that's called The Myth of
mm,
Like-Minded Community.
mm,
And why I would say this is for me, your community, yes, this is in person, but it's actually not people that you agree with, right? And you may or may not share some values with or preferences with people that you're in community with. But from my perspective, the women that I'm in community with might specifically be the women that I don't actually agree with, but I'm willing to be in relationship with anyway. And so we might actually have significant values divergence, but I'll drop off a meal for you postpartum anyway. But I will pick
mm,
up your kids anyway. But I will share your GoFundMe for something that I don't actually agree with anyway, whatever it is. And so
mm,
that difference of the people I am not in deep and close relationship with, but I'm willing to be community engaged with, those are community relationships from my viewpoint.
mm,
And that is actually what's existed for all of humankind, right? So you talk about growing up in church in a small town, right? I kind of have a similar background. And the idea that I would like agree with how someone lived their lives, and that would somehow be the prerequisite for us having not just a cordial relationship, but truly one of mutual support. That is just not it's not the type of world I want to live in. I want to live in a world where community means mutual support across difference. And I
mm,
think in our contemporary culture, we have confused, as I said before, some like kind of online uh, interest coalition or like convergence in the sort of follower, I put that in quotes, culture with community. And then I think there's also some confusion between friendship relationships and communal relationships, which I also think are it's very helpful to have a distinction there, where if I find a woman that I vibe with on like her character and sort of what speaks to me about her personally, and we have values alignment and we have preference alignment. I'll talk in a minute about preferences versus values, but that's actually quite rare. Like if I find 10 of those women in my lifetime, I am I'm wealthy in that specific friendship capacity. Maybe, and I mean, I have more friends than that. I like, because I really like women and I have a broad network because I know a lot of women due to my work. But even still, like if I'm not actually like it's a rare thing I believe to have
mm,
happen. And when we put this idea that my community relationships actually all need to have this character alignment, preference alignment, values alignment, we lose sight of the fact that that's never how it's been. And that we have been in relationship with the people that surround us, and that I think is actually a really supportive mindset to adopt or to utilize when we're interested in building community in person, which, as you were saying, so many women want that and desire that, but there's all these barriers like, oh, no one thinks like me. People would think I'm weird. People wouldn't have these preferences. No one would agree with me. They do it this way. I don't like that. Or I do it this way. They won't like that. All of these narratives that come up, which puts so much pressure and so much stress on relationship building, which that's never where those, relationships actually build and thrive. So, I mean, there's a few threads that we could pull there. The difference between friendship and community relationships being one. And then we can expound in a minute if you're desirous on the difference between values and preferences, which I think is really helpful for this conversation as well.
Yeah, let's do it.
Do you have any comments or do you want to offer? Should I just keep going?
Yeah, keep going. Let's talk about what you say, friendships and community relationships, the difference there.
Yeah. So
Mhm.
within that, I am going to just cycle to the values versus
Mhm.
preferences conversation, because I think often we have mistaken values for preference in our contemporary culture. And this is, I do think, an aspect of online culture, because preference-based relationship building is so easy.
Mhm.
And so everyone, is like, oh, do you like this? Then they're probably like this as well. The algorithm just being like, do you like
Yeah.
these? I don't know, whatever, bleeding underwear, if I'm speaking to your audience, then you might like this, whatever profile, or you might like, did you follow this birth content? Then you might also like this birth content. Did you follow this holistic health content? Then you're probably interested in this as well. Um, and that kind of confirmation bias and incredible suggestion, where we are now having like a preference-based exposure. And when we have constant preference-based exposure, we forget, and this is just human, right? This is just the way our brains are wired. We stop having continuous consideration and sort of reckoning with things that are largely outside our preferential scope. And
Mhm.
an example of this might be, I don't know. I don't know what your food views are. This one is kind of low hanging fruit, but maybe you're like the Weston A. Price mom and you're like into the raw milk and you're into the bone broth and you're into the mineral density and you're into the like nourished woman vibe. Okay. As you define it. And there's this idea that, the vegan moms that raise their kids vegan have different values than you do. And
Mhm.
that might be true. But what I have personally found is like, oh, maybe your values are that you understand the relationship between food and health. Maybe your values are the social relationship of cooking with your kids every day and having that be the backbone of your family culture. Maybe your values have to do with sourcing food seasonally or within your local agricultural zone. Maybe the value has to do with whatever. I could expound. And your preference based on an individual woman's lived experiences, usually, and her individual information exposure, which is so diverse in our contemporary online culture, is those preferences land them in different places. And that preference might be, I prefer a vegan diet and I prefer a Weston A. Price animal-based diet. But the values that are underpinning those might actually be quite common: food, local agriculture, family, cooking, the relationship between ingredient choice and health, right? And we have immediately said that I have different values than this woman, and therefore I might not be in a relationship with her in a way that would feel useful to me, because I have a sense of
Mhm.
mistaken preference for value. And I find that could be proliferated everywhere. And I find that women often have similar values. And this has really helped me
Yeah.
in being able to serve women, because I serve all kinds of women in my practice, right? I can't, I assume that they don't share my values, probably, or my preferences, because that would be nuts for me to
Mhm.
assume that. And I am quite interested, because ultimately I believe that women are smart usually, and that, or they have whatever. That's sort of a stupid thing to say. I just respect women being who they are. That might be a better way to say it. And that if their choices are considered, that's amazing, right? And then they have come to whatever conclusion they've come to. And if their choices aren't considered, maybe because they have never, had the invitation to really consider where their views come from, then that's something that I will like invite women to do. And I lead, some programs that are about that, about, values, like values understanding, right? Really understanding your own ethics, where they come from, why you think what you think, how to talk about what you think. But that's very different than actually teaching a values orientation,
Mhm.
because I value women who know what they think and why. and that it comes from their own personal experience and that they can talk about it. Those are relationships that I really enjoy, regardless of the preferences or values often. And that has truly expanded my community in real time, because the women that surround me, all of a sudden I'm finding values alignment where I previously saw what I took as values divergence. And that's taken me a long time. And ultimately it comes down to loving women. I love women and I want to be in community with women. And that love and that desire is at the core for me. So I am forever considering, what are ways that I can do that better? What are ways that I can respect women more? What are ways that I can love women more? What are ways that I can be in better relationship with women, from a personal perspective and also from a service perspective, because my life and my professional career is dedicated to service of women. So I feel as though I have a responsibility to be thinking about how to be in respect, in right relationship, and truly express love for women in more and more ways, which, like, oh, it's going to choke me up. It's truly, the responsibility that I want to have, and clarity around values, preferences, community, friendship, in person, online, like getting clearer and clearer about this stuff has allowed me to love women more and serve women more. And that for me is a value that I think a lot of maybe your listeners share.
Yeah, I think we don't know how to get there sometimes, because like a lot of all of our lives are spent online now, on social media, right? And on social media, like you said, you get this opportunity to create your own echo chamber, without even really intending to do that. I mean, just follow people you find interesting who often think like you do. Maybe, yeah, that's sort of how it goes. But that's not what it's like in the people who just happen to live around you. Like, your neighbors are your neighbors. So you didn't pick them, right? And what I have found in right, so I can sort of judge what I think a woman's values or like preferences might be just by looking at her and her life. But when I actually sit in community with that woman, when we have conversations together, I don't often find that we like agree on all the topics, but I do find there's so much more common ground than I thought there was, right? And that there's some beautiful peace in there that each of us can receive from each other when we're open to it, and that there's more common than not, I have found.
Yeah. And I find that how many of us have had the concept that, oh, I'm here in this like-minded community. And then when it really gets down to it, it falls apart. And I really want to bring that up as well, because I think a lot of women have been hurt by that. And there's all this talk in our contemporary culture around like the sister wound and like, what are like this like loss of community. And in my opinion, a lot of it is a little how can I say it? Not misplaced, but it hasn't served me. I'll put it that way. It hasn't served me, because the concept that my values, and which I will rephrase here as preferences, are things like, which are what I thought were values, which were actually preferences. And then I gather with women around these preferences, which maybe are, I don't know, I'm just speaking to your audience, which are, I don't know, maybe you're into unschooling and free birth and whatever it is that you're into. And then you actually get in deep relationship in maybe some, communal spaces that are organized around those principles. And it can be a bit of a mess. Maybe there isn't actually as much as alignment as you thought. Maybe there's actually conflict, or maybe there's otherwise. I did some polls on this on Instagram, this idea that if they only knew what I actually thought about this specific point, then I worry that there would be a rift. Right.
Yeah,
And
that's a thing that happens in those communities that are like fully aligned, right? Like, so I've joined some like online free birth communities, which
or even in-person communities, I've seen this happen as well
Oh
too.
yeah.
Like it's not, this is not
When
just
it's around a value, like, or a thing that like we're all going to be the same on this, and therefore we're probably all the same on these other things.
I would say it's not a value.
Right.
I would say it's a preference, and that our lack of real social understanding is kind of at the root of some of this dysfunction. And
right, because our values probably are the same, but the way we're expressing them and the conclusions we've arrived at how to express those values are what's different.
Or maybe your values aren't the same. And this is something else, which is like, it's okay to be in community relationship across values divergence. But if you are expecting deep sisterhood and friendship across values convergence, and you actually find that you have preference convergence and values divergence, right? That can really send people for a loop. So like for me, I have one of my like values like that I truly have is like I have a faith-based value system, which okay, I don't actually, and I'm like actually friends with women, yeah, like not just community relationships, who do not have a faith-based value system. But for the most part, I am friends with women who do share that value system, but our preferences are wildly different, right? And to be able to be clear on that has really helped me have relationships that feel fulfilling to me. And you might find that like what you think about women, what you think about men, what you think about God, what you think about the body, what you think about, you know, I mean, those are just some that come up for me, right? What you
Mhm.
think, those maybe are often not just mere preferences. Those might actually be sort of deeper underlying underpinnings of how you want to move through the world. And those I have seen time and time again actually come up as some sort of the foundation of conflict that is found
Mm.
in previously considered to be like value minded community, right? This sort of like minded community where there is actually things that are deeper that women might not actually agree on. And if they're considering their preferences are where they need to bond, but then there's things that are much deeper. This can breed things like gossip. This can breed things like talking
Mm.
behind women's back. This can breed things also just feeling like you're unable to reveal what is actually deeply important to you, which I don't actually think is necessarily the environment. Like, I don't think our communal relationships are necessarily the environment for revealing what's the deepest and closest to our values. It's the,
Mhm.
and like, I mean, that to me feels like a friendship moment or like this deep relationship moment. And this idea that maybe we have to, you know, say what our deep values are to like put them all out there to be sure that like everyone's in alignment. I'm like, I don't know. Like the women that I know in person, all of them don't actually know you know, my personal holiest and highest or like my deep interpersonal sort of intimacy. And that maybe from years of in-person communal relationship, we might be able to grow that. But I'm not putting that out there and expecting that to be held and supported necessarily in a communal setting. And this is, I'm not trying to have this be sort of confusing, but the lines around intimacy and sharing have also been, I think, somewhat confused in our social media era. This idea that we like
Mhm.
put it all out there, this idea that like everything is there to be examined and either said yes to or no to, that there's either this like, approval or rejection, and then like everybody knows everything, and then therefore we can choose. That's never how communal relationships have been. They've always
Mhm.
been, I read a lot of historical novels, for example. I mean, I'm like a history buff. And I thought something that is always so interesting to me as I'm studying sort of rhetorical choices and is what a skill it is to be interested, supportive, and also have a sense of privacy,
Mhm.
and the relationship between privacy and withholding, and what are your intentions, and like these are the social skills that I think are largely being diminished. And when you're saying that so many of us are like, how do we actually get to this like true sense of community cohesion, this is some of the things that this is what we work on in my women's work program, but even just in my personal life, it's like, can you clarify your values? Can you identify how they're different from preferences? Right? Can we understand where we're actually interested in having intimacy versus support? Where do those overlap? And then what does that look like in real time about how you actually communicate with women? Your word choice, your sentence structure, your syntax, your rhetorical style, what it is that you actually want to say. Because these are skills that would be like, it's like the art of being in community. And if we weren't
Mm.
actually raised within that setting or have largely now moved away from it due to our contemporary online culture, it's not that we all just like suck at being in community. And that's why everyone's like, how do I find my like minded? Or everyone's relocating and they can't quite get it right. Or people don't, or they feel judged. Or they feel afraid that women will judge them. Or they feel afraid to, of the women who actually think differently than them. Or you're like organizing against women who actually don't agree with you. And like that entire quagmire, which not saying that that hasn't happened for all of human history, but I do think it's really dialed up at
Mhm.
this moment. And I think there is a very specific sort of skill set that is cultivatable and some frameworks that can help us with this stuff rather than just the idea that we all somehow need to quote unquote grow up or like get better at it, right? No, there's some framework here that I think is very, very helpful that has been edited out of our contemporary conversation. And I'm interested, obviously, in having these conversations. That's why we're here talking about the nitty gritty of, you know, of women being in a relationship with other women and community building more broadly.
Yeah, the like online relationships are so one dimensional. I find like you present like it's a sound bite of one thing, and that is a way I think before having online relationships, and like I'm old enough to remember not having online
Yeah, me
relationships,
too. I like got
like just
Instagram 3
barely.
years ago. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like in my 30s, like I didn't know.
Yeah, and now I can see so even in starting this podcast, I felt like really anxious about putting my voice out in basically a one-dimensional way. I mean, like you and I are having a conversation right now in a way that I might not have say the same things if I was talking to someone else. And there's this piece where like you say your truth and you're the same all the time. But I think maybe that's what you're speaking to in the art of community, in the art of conversation, the art of building relationships is I don't share all of my values black and white out with every person I meet. And I will speak them in a more nuanced way. And I'll be open to hearing different things depending on who I'm talking to. If it's someone where we have different
Also, like,
preferences or values.
oh, can I just have a little moment on this? Okay.
Yeah.
How egomaniacal to think that I am like, that I should be sharing everything that I think about the world with somebody. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that seems wild to me. I also think that this concept of like everyone's marketing to everybody all the time, which I get it. I run an online business. I'm not here to like, whatever, throw shade or on that. But the idea that my like ideal client, there's so much talk on this. It's like, oh, your ideal client, your ideal listener is this like very specific archetypical, woman. And that very often she's like you, but like a few years ago, or you, but like not as much as you, hasn't whatever gone through the learning that you've gone through. And I'm like, is there a more egomaniacal way to consider serving women than to be
I just want to
looking
serve myself.
for versions of yourself and
Mm.
identifying the women that are like this very specific niche that you have come up with in your brain that is like somehow interesting or a version of you, which like that's a little gag me with a spoon, if I may.
Mm.
And then orient your entire allegedly service-based business to women on that
Mm.
model. That's insane. That's insane. I mean, okay, I'm being a little ravey. It's not insane. It's profitable. I get it. It is profitable. And we all do that to a certain degree. So let me walk it back. It's not insane, but it's like, I get fired up about that specifically because like I don't actually just want to serve this one woman, this one ideal client, this previous version of myself. That's not service. That's business.
Mm.
And yes, I run a business. Maybe many of your listeners do as well, right? But I actually want a service-based ethic. And to me, service to community is based on how do I provide something to women, like to a variety of women. And if we go back to the kind of original service ethic, it wouldn't be your ideal client. It would be everyone who lived in a 50-mile radius. It would be
Mm.
everyone, like all kinds of people that that your offerings are oriented towards. How do I actually serve this entirely broad, spectrum of individuals with my skill? And I feel grateful because before I ran an online business, I ran an in-person business. I actually like did community organizing in person. I actually had a busy midwifery practice where I served whatever the people that were around me, right? And I taught in person in public spaces for 10 years. And you're guaranteed to have different people. And that is what I really try to bring forward into my online work. And it's so easy in online work to cloister. It's so easy in online work to say, this is who this is for. If this is you, all of the marketing, content, which
Mm.
yes, there is a degree of that. I'm not like knocking this. It's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I am interested in having an underlying ethics that is as relatable to the type of in-person community that I have actually enjoyed and, was able to be, able to provide a service within that community. And because if I didn't, otherwise I find online culture to be very depleting. If
Mm-hmm.
I was actually just talking within an echo chamber and, not only does not allow me to grow and change and develop my skills, which I is what I feel like my responsibility to women is to grow and change and develop my skills, because maybe they don't actually have the opportunity to do that because they're doing something else cool, right? In whatever given area. So if my responsibility as someone who's, providing a service to women is to grow and change and develop my skills, then I actually need that flexibility in what I'm offering. I need to be able to change my mind. I need to be able to speak to that. I need to be able to hear why other women are changing their minds. And if everything is about alignment, not difference, I think it ultimately harms women. And that's the opposite of the point if my goal and my ethic is service. So,
Yeah, and it's going to lead to disappointment in community if you're just
yes.
looking for the version of you. It's not there. There's actually like no one in my circle of friends or community who are just like me, however many years ago or now.
Right.
It doesn't work that way. And also, imagine if it was. Imagine if I found a bunch of carbon copies of myself at different stages of life, how boring that would be. What would I ever learn? What would ever, like, I have evolved and changed so
Mhm.
much in my
Mhm.
values, and I
Mhm.
continue to. And like what
Mhm.
I think today, I may not think tomorrow. As I learn more, I'm open to learning. And I think the only way that happens is through divergent opinions and through seeing women doing life differently, and having conversations about it, which in my experience cannot happen. It cannot happen online. It's a nuanced thing that happens in person. And we can actually, I found, even in my community, like acquaintances, I feel like individually, I can have conversations about all those topics we're not supposed to ask questions about, that we're not supposed to talk about, that we're supposed to just assume. Um, I can ask those questions and we can have respectful discussions, and I can reflect on my own feelings about them and evolve if that's the way to go.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
I am, yeah, this sort of the the evolution, I think, is a really lovely point, as well as the conversational aspect. And, whether I've definitely built really wonderful, lasting relationships online, like I have actually, and they've become, like we were talking about, a dear friend of mine who I saw her uh, initially as, she sought pelvic health care from me, and then she took some programs, and then she came and was with me in person, and then we like fell in love, and now we travel across the country multiple times a year to like see each other, and I refer to her as my work wife, and we're just like homegirls, and we met online, we met through the Instagram, and this was years ago now, and we're obsessed with each other. So I'm not saying that that doesn't happen. Of course it does. I've made very lasting relationships, but ultimately it's because we spend time in person. That was,
Mhm.
and what I, if you are looking at the rest of my work, right, and even just like my intro, like I study the body in a variety of different ways,
Mhm.
and there is a reality of sort of corporal communication and like actually embodied. I know that word gets used a lot, and so let me define what I mean by that. Like, I'm in my body, in actual time and space with somebody else, like that, like in the very
I live
simplistic
in
meaning.
here.
I live in here and I'm here and you're right there, and we're actually, I can physically touch you, like as a
Mhm.
very direct, you know, meaning of embodiment. But the the skill, I think, is what I do want to come back to, and like how you're saying that you were actually able to develop that through being in relationship with people in person, and that there
Mhm.
are and really in conversation. And we're having a more detailed conversation right now because we've got a couple hours. And then, yeah, we're on a video chat, but like that's actually still more detailed um,
Mhm.
than what would be, available through, if you're in my DMs, or like if
Mhm.
you're responding to my IG content, or you're even listening to a podcast episode, right? It's still not actually face to face, like, it's not actually in real time communication. And what a weird thing that we've adapted to as humans, because that would never be the case. Like, I grew up with a landline
Yeah.
until I was like in my 20s, like it's
Yeah.
just the idea that yeah, just the constancy. And not here to sort of uh glorify the 90s. I'm not, like, I think that's kind of boring as well, but I
Mhm.
just there
They're like,
is
don't
some,
forget that's a thing too.
don't forget
Don't.
that's a thing too, right? Don't forget that that actually is a thing, and that maybe a lot of the challenges that we're having are
Yeah.
because there has been a little bit of uh, just like forgetting and not actually availability for the in-person in-person skill
Mm.
building, or even if it's not in person, through bringing these concepts of what we actually know about communication and history and the way that humans interact and build relationships, even just bringing those concepts into an online space, which is what I do as to the best of my ability with the online work that I serve.
Yeah,
Um,
another piece I appreciate that you said is, which I hadn't directly thought about this, but how these skills are only built in community. And in that way, when we're building skills, we're not good at it at first. You're going to fumble around and make some mistakes and say some
mhm.
stupid things. And like
Oh, yeah.
that has to be part of the learning, I would think.
And don't we need to chill so we can actually do that with each other? And this is the other piece. So, when I say this has to happen in community, I referenced briefly my women's work program, which is where we really work on this stuff,
Mm,
and not in a navel gazing, like, let me figure out how to be a more mature adult, like, which means nothing to me. That's like actually the skills, which are, what are the lenses that I look at women through? Just even that. Am I looking at women through a lens of class, race, motherhood status, family, geography, culture, socioeconomic status, her views on feminism, her views on other women? Like, what are the lenses through which I gaze at other women? And just being able to identify what those are, because ultimately I find that they say it way more. They talk about me, they don't actually talk about her. And unless I'm able to have a sense of comprehension of what those are and what my patterns are in that way, I continue to see women through those lenses, which really limits my ability to appreciate them and love them in a
mm,
way that is helpful. Um, and the way that I might identify that is in conversation and communication with other women. That's not just something that
mm,
I'm ultimately going to be able to do in my little,
mm.
personal, like in my head,
Or just be
it,
born with.
or just be born with. No, I'm
Mhm.
like, oh, wow, I'm actually present with when this woman says this thing that I deeply disagree with, or she is expressing a way that she lives her life that is really outside of my values purview. What is it that I'm thinking about? Like, what are the lenses that I'm looking at her through? And
Mm,
that requires community interaction. That requires actually being in relationships with women that do it differently than you. And and this is where I just am so impressed by the women that are actually interested in
mm,
this and are willing to do that and share with that as well. So um in women's work, like the what we're talking about is like building relationships across values divergence, building communication skills. And the women that are in that program are women that are like, I want to be in conversation in relationship with women who hold diametrically opposed views from me.
mm,
And I want to know who I am there. And I want to be able to practice being able to walk my walk there. And if you have this experience ever of like being tongue tied or wishing you'd said it differently or wishing you could actually like say what you mean, and that interaction that you have, and then like you're rehearsing what you would have said later and being like, oh, I wish I'd said this or that. And like the only way we will ever improve that is through practice. And what a gift to choose to be with other women who are like, that is the skill that I want to practice. Oh my gosh,
mm,
how amazing. So, um, yeah, I think that that aspect of doing it in real time and doing it, and obviously I'm running this as an online cohort, which I get it. I get the tongue in cheekness of what I'm sharing. It's not lost on me, but it's what we have available is to be able to practice
mhm,
these skills in this way. So then you can actually go into your own community and maybe start a women's circle. And you have these women that don't actually think like you. And so who are you then? And how do you actually continue to build relationships then? And that begins
mhm,
with a sense of practice and clarity. And the other thing that I'll say here is being able to, as I said, understanding the lenses through which you look at women is really cool and helpful. And then also just understanding your personal values, like what it is, not just the lenses that you look through, but what are your values and ethics? Like, what is it? How do you, at this moment, actually want to orient towards women? How do you want to choose to live your life in regards to your family, your work, your relationships with other women? And then what are the things that when you don't know, like what are your touchstones that you go back to? so that you are able to say, oh, I don't actually know what I think about this, then where would you go? Who would you talk to? What would you read? What would your practices be? Like, what are some practical things if you actually are in a moment of discovery or confusion or evolution or flexibility that can help us continue to move through that and be in that ever flowing stasis or like status from clarity into flexibility into growth into clarity into flexibility and into growth because it I found that I have been far more able to be in deep relationship with other women who disagree with me because I am actually clearer on my own values. And in a somewhat
Mm.
paradoxical way, the clearer I am and the better that I can articulate why I think what I think and the work that I have done to say I think what I think based on my personal experience, not based on what I heard on Instagram, not based on co-regulating with somebody
Mm.
in my community who I have some dynamic with, not based on, sort of what the ethics or values that I was brought up on and was never really able to consider in a critical way given my own personal experience. But when this is my life experience, I've thought about it, this is what I think, and this is how I can articulate it in 3 sentences or less with no attempt to convince or prove anybody else. When I'm able to do that, I'm actually able to be flexible because I'm not
Mm.
in a nervous system state where I can't truly take in what another woman has to think and say, ideally based on her personal experiences and her personal values clarification, which then we're really building this sort of quality and in my experience truly satisfying relationships with other women. Like that's when it really scratches the itch for me having that relational need met, and then I might change my
Mhm.
mind because only when I'm really hearing from other women who are able to do that, that's the only thing that's ever actually really helped me truly evolve and be actually open-minded. And I think that that can be the paradox, right? Where you're like, "Oh, wait, I need to get clear about what I think and why to be able to change my mind." And in my experience, yes, absolutely. Because then I know what my mind isn't based on. And if I know what it's based on, then it could technically be based on something else as, life continues to progress and we continue to grow and change. And when we build relationships and communities that have that framework at the core, I find that they become more robust over time rather than maybe a relationship that a lot of women and your listeners have had, which is there's this like really tight, like, oh my God, we're all down with this stuff, this preference, and it's awesome. And then like a few years later, we're actually in a space of fracture. We're actually in a
Mm.
state of like, oh, what would she think if I did that? Or like, how would this actually be? Or like, if I moved or if I was different or if I changed my mind or if I decided to stay with my abusive partner, if I decided to leave my husband because of something that he did, or if I decided to terminate a pregnancy, or if I decided to organize against other women's right to terminate pregnancies, or if I decided to vaccinate my kids, or if I decided I didn't want to vaccinate my kids. I don't care what it is. But when it actually becomes like, whew, those things where the rubber meets the road that life is guaranteed to bring upon you and other women,
Mhm.
a community that can not only like survive that, but that can actually deepen the web of community support and potentially of actual sisterhood of like actual deep friendship that is based on your ability to remain, your ability to stay in relationship, which it's the final frontier, honeys. It's not
Mhm.
outer space, right? It's like, can we remain? And I'm not saying toxicity, I'm not saying like,
Mhm.
horrible abusive dynamics. But I think that stuff gets thrown around all the time. Her views are toxic. The way that is done is like really harmful. And I'm like, okay, it might be. And that's where discernment comes in and how we actually want to orient. But I think more often than not, the skill that has supported me is the ability to, to know what I think and why, speak it clearly in 3 sentences or less, and know what my values are. And personally, valuing, remaining, and sustaining, and figuring out how to love women more and be in service more.
Yeah, it makes sense in the way as well that if I can really articulate my values well, I don't need them to be validated from the outside. And
Boom.
so I can express them in a regulated way. And when I can have a regulated conversation with you about things we disagree with, then I can actually hear what you're saying.
Of
And it
course.
doesn't mean we might still never agree. We might never
Mhm.
arrive at the same conclusion, but I have found that I can hear in an empathetic way and I can
Mhm.
sometimes I can see how you got there.
Mhm.
I'm not going to get there, but I
Mhm.
can see how you and your intelligence and being, as my community member and,
Mhm.
the person I know you are, I see how you arrive there and I respect that. I'm not going to get there too. Whereas, yeah, if I need the external validation, or yeah, I'm feeling very triggered on the subject, no way. No way can I hear what you're saying.
And
It's
it's so
not going to
threatening.
happen.
Like, no way could I
Mhm.
get there because who would I be if I was there? And like
Yeah.
that is, and it's like,
Yeah, that's maybe you can speak to like the problem with identity politics there. Or just like
um, yeah.
broadly. Come
Not
on
the
now.
problem of identity politics. Yeah.
How
So,
that prevents community, right?
right.
Like, how does that, when we're
Mm.
identifying with a system like that, yeah, how's that going to play out?
If I am committed to my entire identity and self concept being about differentiation based on my preferences, then as my preferences change, my identity ceases to have solid ground on which to remain.
Mm.
So, in that circumstance, I find that identity politics, and I want to be really clear here, I'm no magical unicorn. Like, I've done all this stuff. I've, had stances and burned bridges and had identity politics. And, I was also 22 and convinced that I was right about everything, and 27 and convinced even of it more than, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not better than this. I just, I want to offer that. But honestly, now I don't really have any lines in the sand, which I know that can
Mm.
be quite, that's not true. The way you treat animals and the way you treat children need to be up to snuff by my personal judgment standards. But other than that, I like kind of don't have any lines in the sand. And lines in the sand around me being willing to be in service to you. Like, that's what my lines in the sand would or wouldn't be. The identity aspect being the basis for community orientation, as I said, not only do I personally find that it limits growth, but it also, in my experience, has limited my ability to create a sense of resiliency, which resiliency has been a huge supportive skill for me to build in regards to maintaining and building community relationships and maintaining and what I mean by that is the concept of I am only in a sense of safety. My nervous system can only be regulated. I can only actually be loving and chill if we are in agreement on certain topics.
Mm.
Um, has at different moments in my life meant that I have put myself in community circumstances, or sort of communal circumstances, maybe would be a better use of the term, where everyone would agree with me. And so, because I would just like feel triggered or feel upset or feel uneasy or like not be able to express myself. And then I would be stressed out and then like, oh, this doesn't serve me. Like like this
Mm.
isn't what I need for my community or whatever. And that, um, the ability to not equate my sense of safety, which you know, I am a little bit critical of the contemporary use of
Mhm.
that term with, uh, with people like agreeing with me or affirming me or being hyper aware of my triggers. Which I'm not saying there's not a sense of sensitivity and respect, but when I have been in environments that were very much like, okay, here is your, like, this might trigger you, or I might disagree with you, and like, why don't you just like prepare your nervous system if that's the case? And it's like, I feel like I've been infantilized in that way, and I feel like it's
Mm.
minimized or like it can, and it doesn't at this juncture, but my resiliency to be able to manage um, the actual sort of complications of interpersonal relationship. And that is very common in the idea of identity politics, where we're all gathering around a shared cohesive identity, which, again, I'm not saying that there's not moments for that. I'm not saying that there's not I'm not saying there's not value
Mhm.
for,
But don't
yeah,
mistake that for
don't
community.
mistake that for community. Exactly.
Mhm.
That can be, an interest group. That
I
can
think
be,
a
yeah, go
heartbreak
ahead.
comes out of that too for people. Like, I've seen that in churches. I've seen that in, right, where you think like you found your people because you identified around a topic.
Mm,
Um, and
mhm,
it, like, not like it's a problem, but when you, right, that's when people leave and leave with trauma,
mhm, mhm,
is when, yeah, that felt like that was, you thought that was community. You thought that was relationship. And it's disappointing. And
mm.
yeah,
Yeah,
people
and it
can
can
be
be
disappointing.
really disappointing. It can be really destabilizing.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
as I'm interested in what is of service to women, stable relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Like I can't stress that enough. Stable, long-standing relationships are stabilizing to women and children. And if my and I work in women's health. I run a well woman care practice. I do all the stuff. And if women are like, I need to heal my prolapse, I need to do whatever, which totally I can tell you all the biomechanics. I can absolutely help you do that. Heal your painful sex or your chronic infections or whatever it is. But the environment in which that actually needs to happen is an environment where a woman can ultimately center herself within her daily life to a
Mm-hmm.
certain extent, right? And the primary thing that I've seen allow for that is sustainable relating. If I was to like narrow it down into one thing, which obviously, life is multifaceted, but you know, I can tell you all the stuff you want and I can tell you all the things you need to do every day. But fix whatever chronic, health concern, fix whatever, you know what I'm
Mm-hmm.
saying? They'll be supportive for your long-term health. Doesn't,
Yeah.
I'm not trying to get too caught in the language, but if we don't actually have an environment where we're able to do so because of our like emotional, social, cultural, familial structure, okay, then those things might need to shift for that woman to be able to center her body in a way that's going to be supportive of her long-term, sort of health and physiological integrity as a woman. And the shift that is so often supportive, or like what so often kind of makes or breaks that change, is long-standing, stable relating. And
Mm-hmm.
that is really what brought up, when I started, doing women's work or really organizing around this skill set, is because I was seeing all of these women learn all the stuff that could help them physiologically, but ultimately be unable to
Mm-hmm.
implement it. And that lack of implementation, that everyone's like, oh, I need to change my whole life. I need to, quit my job or move cities or like like have a different marital structure, whatever it is, these things that seem really big, which maybe some of those do actually need to shift. But what will allow those to shift, I've seen more often than not, is support, in person,
Mm-hmm.
real life, long-standing support. And the skills to create that, in my opinion, are what we've been discussing already today.
Yeah.
Are
Because
Go
yeah,
ahead.
and the skills I feel like, so if I want that in my life, I think, well, how do I get that? I become that woman. So how do I
Mhm.
become that woman? I become, like, from what you're saying, like I become solid in my values. I become solid in the things I believe. So I'm unshakable in that way and I can hold space and be in
Unshakable but
community and
flexible.
relationship.
Like
Right.
that's the
Unshakable in the
important
way
part.
that I am not triggered,
Right.
but that I'm here for the conversations, that I'm here for women who are in a different place than me. And then I'm open to shifting and I'm open to staying here and still staying in relationship and creating those stable spaces for myself and for other women.
Mhm. Yeah. And
Mm.
then our lives start to transform. And like
Yeah.
I have had a year of my life that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy, my last year. And I'm standing and doing my thing because of the relationships that I have
Mm.
had with other women. And everything about my life has changed. And if my life was based on, or if all those relationships, I should say, were based on the sort of trappings of my life, then when every trapping of my life disintegrated, then what would remain? And I'm just so
Mm.
grateful that the relationships in my life, those lasting, the women that have like propped me up, that they weren't actually based on that. They were actually based
Mm.
on this framework of, well, who are you now? And actually interested and actually loving, not cohesive on a sense of shared identity or shared preference. And
Mm.
that is like in my both in my experience and in now my practice, where I've had the gift of serving thousands of women. I can't even, it blows my mind. I just have had women for about a decade now, a little more, tell me what's happening. Tell me what's going on with their bodies, their babies, their marriages, watching their babies come into the world. Are you kidding me?
Mm.
Like, just the gift of that and being able to shift and change and do that in the way that is sustainable, is a gift that I have been given by the relationships that I've been able to build with other women that have been, based on these preferences. And I mean, I'm sorry, based on these concepts rather than based on preferences. And I, um, yeah, I think it really can allow for the type of thing that everyone says they're craving. The type
Yeah.
of, which is like, who are my people? Where is my place? Who has my back? And I'm like, right. How do we do that? That's actual women's work. And I don't
Yeah.
care. I don't really care what it is that you do with that skill. I mean, I don't care if you're, I don't know, running a hair salon, working as a financial planner, or a stay at home mom who's like really interested in her church, or like a body worker or birth worker, but it doesn't matter. Like, this is true, like communal skill building, which is, when you're saying this happens in relationship, like actually in relationship, like healing happens for women in relationship with other people. Skill building on this stuff
Hmm.
cannot happen in an echo chamber. And I am interested in identifying and sort of dismantling the roadblocks that we have created that get in the way of that in a very direct way, not in a like,
Hmm.
let's orient towards community, or like, I want to work on my self healing. Not that I'm like mocking anyone specifically, other than
Hmm.
arguably me and a previous version of myself, but like the just continuing to be to just be community oriented in the way that we're discussing it, and be relational. And what does it really mean to heal in
Yeah.
relationship?
I love that you've created a blueprint for this in my limited online echo chamber. This is the first one I've seen like this. So I love it. It's starting soon.
Yeah.
Is it
So women's
your
wear, it's yeah. So I mean, I'll talk about that in a minute, but it's just also so
Mhm.
nice that you were saying there, like, oh, because you like run a through the veil like home birth podcast, and and which is like amazing. And the fact that like what actually made it through the noise and the algorithm, because like in some ways we actually do have similar echo chambers, you know what I mean? I like
Yeah,
there was a
probably.
lot of convergence, around some
Mhm.
of the work that we both do in the world, but like that's not what made you reach out. What made you reach out was
Yeah.
like, oh, I was like, oh, do you think this? Cool, cool, cool. That doesn't mean we're actually going to be alike. We
Mhm.
actually might not be alike. And this woman that we think is actually not like us, I might actually have more in common with her,
Yeah.
because the way I'm, interested in building relationship is not based on likeness and sameness. And you're like, whoa, that's actually, that's a different viewpoint. And I think that that is just such a cool example of like how we're even now in conversation is
Mhm.
it's about difference, not about likeness, and
Yeah.
how refreshing and just like interesting. It just like makes me want to get to know women more, because it's about getting
Yeah.
to know women individually and helping them or serving them or being in a relationship with them, not their idea, their community, their culture, their choices, their birth, their marriage, their food, whatever. Um,
Mhm.
which, as we all know, can change. Um,
Yeah.
so okay, so what you're saying, so yeah, women's work. This is great. I've run this program. This is my seventh time running it. I've run for the
Wow.
last yeah, I've run for the last
I
five
don't
years.
know how I didn't come across it before this.
Really, maybe it's because I don't do so much like ideal client niche down marketing, which
Yeah.
is like,
Yeah.
it like
This is
yeah. No, I've run this 7 times. This is my seventh round. I've run it for 5 years. I've run the first 2 rounds in person. Shocker,
Mm.
um, which was so cool. And we're interested in values clarification, communication
Mm.
skills, and up leveling your relationships with women. And
Mhm.
so, if this conversation was interesting to you, our cohort starts June 19th, and
Mhm.
you'll be in the community with women um, who disagree with you. And I'm not teaching anyone what values to have. I'm really interested in, and there's like, we have very in-depth curriculum, which I don't know if we have time to get into, but we're
Mhm.
looking at, radical liberal Marxist and reactionary feminist analyses.
Mm.
Women are deciding, as we actually look at the gift of our women's culture, right? Feminism is not an idea to adhere to. It is an analytical structure that varies in its ideology based on different feminist analyses, and we get to utilize these analyses created by women that were there to help us answer these exact questions in this conversation about how to meet the needs of other women. And those women have always had divergent viewpoints, which is why we have all these different branches of feminism, which is why thinking like, oh, I am a feminist or I'm an anti-feminist is a lie. It's not an identity, it's an analysis, and being able to understand how these different analyses can actually inform how we want to move through the world. So we look at that. We do some, reading and writing from different, sort of historical sources. We're
Mm.
also looking at, as we spoke earlier, about the lenses that we look through, really some social identification about how and where we come from, what it is that we believe about women and why. We're going to talk about the body. I know that women are adult human females, and if you don't actually believe that, you're still welcome to join. But that's the perspective from which that I teach this course, and we're going to look at the biological reality of women and how that differs from men, and how that is informing our social space and sphere. And then we really get down into communication skills. Anyone who communicates clearly begins with knowing what you have to say. That's the first thing. And then it also takes practice. And so my ability to just talk on a podcast about this stuff for however long isn't a God-given gift. It's a
Mm.
practice skill from studying rhetorical style, word choice, sentence structure, clarity of ideas. And so if you're ever someone who's like, I just never get it out quite right, then I hear you.
Mm.
That's everyone until they learn
Mm.
differently. Um, and your ability to do your work in the world is directly contingent on your ability to articulate it clearly. So
Yeah.
if you're interested in serving women, knowing what you think and why, not trying to convince or prove, moving away from thesis statement speech and moving into speaking from direct personal experience. Yeah, this is the stuff that we work on. Everyone makes a final presentation.
Mm.
And it's awesome. So if you're interested in that, women's work, and we're enrolling for another, our enrollment closes on Friday. So if you're,
Okay.
so depending when you're listening to this, but if you're listening to it and it's like Saturday, shoot me an email. We start on Wednesday the 19th. And yeah. And even if not
Okay.
women's work, then you can follow me on the socials. I have a insane amount of free content. Um, so much, even like not just Instagram posts, like dozens of podcasts, 2-hour long master classes on a variety of different topics that range from essentially biodynamics and physiological health to birth to women's community. So
Mm-hmm.
um yeah, should we leave it
Yeah.
there? Is there anything else?
Yeah. I don't think so. Are there any other, I know you have some other offerings out in the world. Um, Want to
Yeah,
speak to those at all?
I mean, so we're just talking about community because that's what you reached out about. But yeah,
Mm.
I'm a biodynamicist and a midwife. If you want to learn about the way you sit, stand, move, walk, breathe, how women are different than men, and how that impacts your health, that is absolutely something that is a very foundational aspect of my work. I have programs about healing your prolapse, healing your diastasis recti, strength training programs for women, which I'm, a gym rat and I'm like into that too. And if you're like, I don't want to go to the gym, but I want to heal my diastasis and feel stronger at home, then I'm like here for you. And that's a lot of what I do as well. And then if you are listening to this podcast and you're interested in sovereign birth, if you're interested in unassisted birth, I have a program called Born Through Movement that is an in-depth study of the biomechanics of birth and baby's pathway through the pelvis, which is, I'm so into women understanding how their babies actually come out and how they can actually impact that. And this is an educational resource for women, birth workers, and body workers alike. So if you're interested in that, and we definitely get into a lot of the um, social, emotional, cultural content around midwifery as well within that program, as well as some really, really cool A&P about the brilliance of your body. So
Mm.
that's a lot of sort of very direct work for women and children in the body. And if you're like, yeah, I love all that, but how do I actually do that in my body, in my life, in my community? Women's work, because that's where
That's the crux.
information intake moves into integration and implementation, which that's really what we're all interested in, I think. So
Oh, great. Thank you so much for this conversation.
this was great. I love your
Yeah.
podcast. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for listening. New episodes are released every Tuesday. You can submit your story through the link in the show notes or connect with us on Instagram, link in the show notes as well. Follow, subscribe, share, write us a fabulous review. These are all great ways to be part of the movement toward more powerful and peaceful births. Until next time.